I'm here to discuss front subframe replacement in a 1997 Honda Civic. I bought this car for $400 from a friend of a friend. A lot of people would think that front subframe replacement on a car this old would be cost prohibitive. However, I did it for 3 reasons. Number 1, I'm crazy and I happen to love these old Hondas. Number 2, this Honda happens to be a really good specimen. It has only 111,000 miles and it has some pretty nice options. It's the EX trim. And number 3, I have a lift and a transmission jack, so I decided to perform this job. Now, a couple of things to note. I wouldn't recommend doing this without a lift and a transmission jack. I looked far and wide on YouTube and I couldn't find anywhere where 6th generation Civic subframe replacement was described. If you do this on your driveway with jack stands, I give you a lot of credit. I just don't think it's going to be worth it. It's a really hard job to do. I rate it as difficult, and you know, it's probably not worth trying, and you could even hurt yourself if you did. So without further ado, let's get on with it. This is the replacement subframe. Got it from Fogarty's Junkyard in Norton for $60. I scraped off the rust and painted it with rust reformer. So now with the car up on the lift, looking underneath, we can see the rot on the subframe. This is the exhaust from the manifold back. Follow the subframe over to the passenger side and you can see those big rot holes. On the passenger side, the lower control arm, the back part of the lower control arm on this car is barely even connected to the subframe. And I could notice that as I was driving it home. I pulled it in the garage, got it up in the lift and said, "Jeepers, I can't believe I drove this thing." But I did, and I made it. This side's not so bad, but it looks like it's well on its way. So this subframe needs to be replaced. Underneath the dashboard, remove this plastic boot, get access to the steering column, and match mark the steering column, and then remove the 10mm bolt that goes into the steering column. So this bolt here, you want to match mark it, use a Sharpie. Both the high pressure and low pressure power steering lines need to be disconnected from the rack. I chose to disconnect the high pressure power steering line from up top because it's more accessible. Those are 10mm bolts. The low pressure line from the power steering pump is right above the exhaust line. That's held on with a flathead screw. The catalytic converter will need to be removed. On the front you have 2 bolts that are 13mm with 12mm nuts. You also have an O-ring. On the rear you have a flat gasket and 3 14mm bolts with 3 14mm nuts. If you plan to use an impact gun to remove the rear bolts, I would suggest doing this step first before you raise the vehicle with your jack stands, because it'll be more easily accessible. You can see the O2 sensor is connected. You'll also need to remove that unless you leave it connected and just use bungee cords to hold the cat aside, which is what I plan to do. The lower ball joints and tie rod ends will need to be removed. The strut fork also needs to be removed from the control arm. This is a 17mm. Removal of the rear motor mount. So in order to gain access to the motor mount nut and bolt for the rear motor mount, I removed this air cleaner tube. There's also this evap canister that it attaches to the firewall of the car. That's the slot you lift this little sucker. I pried it up from the bottom of the screwdriver. Lift it. I disconnected one vacuum line from it and was able to pull it forward. Also on the other side of the motor mount, I placed a ratchet. These are 17-inch, the bolt and the nut. So I have a breaker bar on the nut side, and I placed a 17-inch ratchet just to hold the bolt on the other side. And I had to really put my body into that sucker. I hit it with PB yesterday, let it soak, and that's a tough bolt to get off. I did in fact go ahead and remove the exhaust downpipe because the shifter cable needs to come out in order for the subframe to be removed. There is this bracket right here that needs to be removed, 4 bolts, and then this shifter cable comes out. There's a bolt holding this shifter cable arm onto a shaft, and one thing to know is that there's actually this folding lock, this folding piece of sheet metal that locks the bolt on there, so just be mindful of that. You have to pry the wings of that out, and then that takes a 10mm socket. And the arm comes right off. And then remove your shifter cable, and this is for automatic transmission. There's also a bracket that hooks onto the subframe. This also needs to be removed. So now we have the subframe disconnected and on a transmission jack. Billy, give that thing a shake. Show us.
It's still connected in the middle.
Well, I know it's still connected in the middle. So we have the main bolts are removed. As you can see, the lower control arms are attached to the subframe still. We're gonna, switch all that stuff over when we get it onto the ground. But if you look up, you can see that the transmission, the power steering fluid high pressure line is still attached. I'm gonna leave that attached. I disconnected it up top. There's a plug that I disconnected from some solenoid that's attached to that high pressure line as well. So that needs to be disconnected. So you really, when you lower this subframe just like a couple inches, then you gotta reach up there and unplug that solenoid plug. I suppose you could try to do it from up on top before you get this far, but it's real deep in there. It's like down about to the, it would be to the driver's side of that top motor mount that you unbolt. So just one other step. Now we're gonna lower the subframe down and remove it. Okay, so the subframe is removed from the car. We look underneath our undercarriage and you see nothing but firewall. And then we look down here, lowered her off the transmission jack. Here she is on the floor of the garage. Got everything attached to her still. Even the power steering pump high pressure line. You can see the rot. It's right here. Billy, run that light over so I can do this. This whole thing's just gone. See where the control arm's supposed to attach, gone. This whole side, everything just rotted out, so it's all gonna be replaced. And this is our sort of new subframe. Got this in the junkyard. Painted it with some rust reformer, but I see some bubbling. I'm gonna hit that with the scaler and go over it again before I pop the sucker in there. So I've got a little work to do here still. Gotta remove the lower control arms, the stabilizer bar, stabilizer links. I bought new ones, and then that power steering pump's got to come out, and it's going to go in the new one. The power steering pump is housed inside the subframe, and that's it. Removing the steering rack from the old subframe and inserting it into the new subframe, of course, is easier done when the subframe is removed from the vehicle. In order to do this, you need to remove the inner tie rod end on the driver's side of the vehicle. So looking at the driver's side of the subframe, you can see that I removed the tie rod end. It wasn't that hard to do. I do have an inner tie rod removal tube tool. However, what I did was I pulled the boot back, undid the clamp on the boot, pulled the boot back, exposing this square nut on the inside, and then I just removed it with an adjustable wrench. And then you slide the steering rack through this hole that is on the top of the subframe. I know this whole assembly is upside down, but you can see the top of the subframe where the steering column attaches. I also removed the high and low pressure lines just for good measure. I don't know if you have to do that. I went ahead and did it, so I'd recommend doing that anyways. Okay, the replacement subframe is resting on the transmission jack. And we're about to raise her up into the vehicle and bolt her into place. I installed the power steering rack, steering column linkage, high pressure line to the steering rack, low pressure line. It's all there. Just need to bolt her into place and hook her up and slap her back together again.